So, The Flash is the DCEU's Flash movie, which is more or less based on the Flashpoint comics from DC Comics, and it's interesting, I think, that this Flash movie chose to adapt Flashpoint because I think it's a very interesting and playful story, but it's also one that kind of traps the character in cameo land, where it's just basically an excuse to rework a lot of like the heroes and events and be playful with the timeline. Which is kind of in line with with like stuff that Marvel's been doing with Doctor Strange, the Multiverse of Madness, and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. But what I find most interesting about this film is, the fact that it's adapting Flashpoint, which was more or less meant to herald a reboot for DC Comics to just change everything for what essentially was the new 52 of the DC Comics. So, in the same way that the comics were meant to set up a reboot, it feels the same thing here with The Flash, because we've already heard that, James Gunn is going to be taking over, the DC Cinematic Universe, and he's going to be running in a new direction. He's going to reboot Superman, his own version of Batman, and he's going to bring in a whole bunch of different films into the mix with stuff like Supergirl and Swamp Thing and The Authority and stuff like Creature Commandos, all sorts of new stuff. So essentially you have a film that is trying to kind of restore DC Comics as a film franchise, which is, it's equal parts admirable and frustrating at the same time, if that makes any sense. So I'm trying to find the best way to. So I guess I'll go a little bit of point by point here. So you have Barry Allen, once again played by Ezra Miller, established as the Flash, and this film takes place after the events of the Justice League, where the Justice League have more or less been formed, and the Flash is working alongside characters like Batman and the like. And the Flash is he's feeling a little bit devalued. It feels like he's just called in for cleanup. While Batman gets to have the fun chase with stopping the bad guys, the Flash has to go prevent a hospital from blowing up. But also gets a fairly neat sequence where he has to save a bunch of babies from falling out a window, which is equal parts absurd, but also kind of exciting and fascinating for how it sets up the Flash's powers. We get to see the slowing of time that he sees. We get to see how he keeps track of the energy in his body. Which I thought it led to a fairly funny sequence where the Flash had to dart between consuming food to keep up his energy while saving everyone from this building that was toppling to the ground. Falling to the ground. So it's the film gets off to a pretty good start. It's we've established where the Flash is at here. We get to see his powers. We get to see the fun he has with them. We get to see the plight that he's trying to face with himself. And then the film kind of lays into what we expect from what you might expect from the Flashpoint comics, which is Barry is conflicted about the death of his mother when he was at an early age, and the death was blamed on his dad. And so Barry has committed himself, and they've established this in the Justice League film as well, that Barry is committed to try to find a way to get his dad out of prison. And it's not been an easy trial that he's tried to go through here to try to convince everyone of his dad's innocence. But then, while Barry is just kind of zooming around, he discovers that, if I go fast enough, I can travel back in time. And I could probably change the timeline. And so Barry gets the idea. I was well, maybe I could change the timeline so that my mom never has to die. And my father never goes to prison. So I could actually grow up with parents and actually have a better life. And yeah, Barry does that, but inadvertently he ends up being flung into a timeline where he has to reconnect with his younger self. So it's it's weird because like this film, it draws from Flashpoint, but it actually tries to change it and alter it in a way that feels more personal. And on that level, I really do like the things that they change from the Flashpoint comic book. Like, I like that Barry doesn't just come back to the present and discover everything he's changed. Like, he tries to go back to the present, but then accidentally just ends up in a world where he meets his 18-year-old self, and he has a little bit of like a Back to the Future moment where he has to reconnect with the dorkier teenage version of himself and get this version of himself used to his powers. So there's a decent dynamic here between two characters who are essentially both played by Ezra Miller, who are conflicted. So like the older Barry has to convince the younger Barry that about the responsibility of his powers and how to grow up and how to become a better person and basically learn through there. So their dynamic kind of writes itself, and they actually do have some fairly fun, playful moments between them. The problem is that all of Barry's meddling with the timeline has led to some unfortunate events. And chief among those is that Barry no longer has his speed powers, so he can't undo the damage he's done. He's changed the order of events in the timeline, so now General Zod, once again played by Michael Shannon, shows up earlier than expected. Superman is not present, so instead there's a prison break sequence where they have to free the only living good Kryptonian on Earth, which is Supergirl, who's played by Sasha Calle, who does a fairly good job for the few. She has a handful of good scenes that she occupies, and she does a good job, but she kind of more or less feels like a blank slate where you almost wish there were like a handful of more scenes with her. Just it's not that she's bad. She's great. It's just that there's a lot of scenes where it feels like she's trying to make lemonade out of lemon. She's trying to not lemonade, trying to bleed from a stone. Make a stone bleed if I'm trying to make that better. She's doing the best with the few scenes that she's got, and she does a decent job with that. There's also a different Batman this time around. There's a much older Bruce Wayne, who's played by, of course, Michael Keaton, who, of course, when they introduce him, they got to showcase all the old Batman stuff. So this is a different Batman, and by different, I mean it's just the continuation of the Tim Burton Batman. So yeah, Michael Keaton, he's wearing the same Batsuit, he's saying the same lines, he has the same Batmobile, he has somewhat similar the same Batcave, and he also has the same Danny Elfman tune to his to his background music. The interesting thing I think I found out with the Flashpoint comics is how many characters get killed off easily, because the film changes up the story of the comics, because in the Flashpoint comics, like, the world was going to end because of a war between Atlantis and Themyscira. And that's not present in this film. And the war between them also results in these other heroes coming into the mix, like Captain Marvel and Grifter and all these other characters thrown into the mix. And they all don't survive. They all get brutalized. And we get shades of that in this film, but not to the same, like, gut-wrenching degree when the Flash realizes that, oh, I'm actually doing more harm, and I gotta undo the damage to fix everything here. Like, he does have that moment, but it's a much different moment, mostly because, it, without spoiling anything, it shrinks the box of, like, what the Flashpoint comic was meant to be. And it's frustrating because, like, it feels like this story should be more engaging on a personal level, and in certain scenes it does. Like, you do care what happens to Barry Allen here. You understand his plight. I love the way that they stage, I guess, traveling back through time. It's kind of like this spherical treadmill in which he has to kind of like step and like step forwards or backwards, and like the progression of time is seen through these weird, uncanny, like, repeating patterns of the timeline. Visual stuff like that is really cool in the film. But it feels like there's a lacking personal depth to making this story shine brighter. And it's mostly because like there's some weird changes to it that I feel are just made to make the film more serviceable, which I've gone back and forth on, because like it's good and bad. Like on one level, like in the original comics, like they change up Batman's origins so that it's not Bruce Wayne who becomes Batman, but Thomas Wayne who becomes Batman, because they switch it up so that so that Bruce Wayne dies and Thomas and Martha Wayne survive. And then, riddled with guilt, Thomas Wayne becomes Batman, and Martha Wayne, who succumbs to her guilt, basically becomes the Joker. Like, it's weird. It's never really expanded upon much, the specifics of how she became the Joker, but it's basically their marriage has fallen apart, which is more or less the thing. And it feels like I kept waiting for that moment. It's like, okay, so Michael Keaton, he's older, and this takes place earlier in the timeline, so obviously this has got to be Thomas Wayne, right? And no, it's to the best of my knowledge, yeah, it's just Bruce Wayne. It's just like it's a different version of Bruce Wayne, much older, which is weird, because like you'd think it'd be much more interesting to have Thomas Wayne there, especially because like the whole big like epilogue of Flashpoint was like, was reliant on Barry Allen meeting Thomas Wayne and being able to relay a message from Thomas to Bruce, making the adventure a little bit more meaningful instead of just repairing the timeline. Like, it feels like Barry brought back a little bit of a souvenir that meant something to someone else and do some good for other people in his life. Like, it's corny, but it worked for the comics. And there are a lot of corny moments in The Flash here that honestly, like, they're trying. Where, like, it kind of works, and you're rooting for, like, Barry Allen to save the day and repair his own timeline and come to the realization that he needs to improve stuff. But the problem with this film is that it still feels bound by a lot of the same issues that plague a lot of the DCEU as a whole. Like, a lot of people have brought this up, like the big climax of the film, in which Supergirl, Flash, and Batman have to fight General Zod. It occurs, like, the big battle goes down in this deserted, empty, flat, plain environment. There's no buildings, there's no people around. It's just like, Earth soldiers and Kryptonian soldiers fighting against each other, and it doesn't carry the same weight, especially because this film feels like the climax. I might have to get into spoiler territory here, and I'm not going to try to. I'm going to try to make this as spoiler free as I can, but it feels like the climax, everything that's set up with Barry and the timeline and how this relates to the rest of the DCEU, that the climax should take place in Metropolis when it was getting pounded to the ground in Man of Steel. Because I feel like this is one of the things where it feels like it's a limitation of the DCEU, because they started with Man of Steel, in which they had the big battle in Metropolis, and there was lots of collateral damage, and thousands of people died, and a lot of people criticized the film for that. And since that film, there's been this, like, shifting away to making sure that the heroes battle in, environments that are less, like, detrimental to, like, buildings and people, that it feels like this is the culmination of that, where it's just like, okay, so the Flash is gonna, fight Zod in this deserted, barren environment in which no innocent people can be hurt. But here's the problem with that. Like, if there were any film where you'd want to have, like, lots of collateral damage and thousands of people dying, it would be this fight. Because the whole point of the climax in Flashpoint is Barry witnessing the inhumanity and basically the death of Earth to realize that he has to repair the world. He has to go back and undo the damage that he does. And that more or less happens within this film, but And to its credit, they do a decent job trying to get Barry to realize this amid the battle he's having here. But it just would have worked so much better if you set it in Metropolis, especially since there's an inciting incident that you set up that it makes you feel like, okay, the climax should take place in Metropolis. There's closure there. There's it's more visually stimulating. There's lots of elements that you could expand upon and make the thematic themes, the thematic elements here hit so much harder had this taken place in Metropolis. And it's one of those things where it's like, you look at it and you can't help but feel like this is a general problem of the DCEU. Because if you set the climax, which is supposed to be dark, it's supposed to be futile, it's supposed to be hopeless, but it feels like if you set that climax away from all that carnage, it lessens the impact and it doesn't take advantage of everything that you could build with Barry in that instance. So like that's my biggest qualm with the film, is that it has so much potential to be a grand finale to the DCEU. And it just doesn't end up being one. Not just because like we got like a few other like DCEU runoff projects before we get to like the James Gunn era, which is way more exciting, and I'm looking forward to like the reboots of Superman and all that. But it's just like this film, it's like it's trying so hard, and it's like I give it an A for effort. It's really trying to make an exciting Flash film, because like they do a great job establishing Flash's powers and like answering questions that might have been lingering in your head, and they explore them in a fun and exciting superhero way that's kind of cool. The visual effects are they teeter between being really cool and just kind of mundane, like especially during like the big climax and the daylight deserted field that they're doing battle in. That just, it doesn't really hit that hard. And also the abundance of cameos, like there's cameos within both like the DCEU and outside the DCEU, and speculation on what could happen with DC Comics films and different comic book iterations and different TV iterations. And I feel like this is like a big problem with this film coming out so close to stuff like Across the Spider-Verse, because Across the Spider-Verse does such a great job kind of like integrating all its cameos and never slowing the film down here. When it has to just like, hey, remember this character? Well, he's here, and this character's here, and this character's here, and well, hang on, we'll get back to the plot, but we gotta slow down, we gotta stop, and have the character turn to the camera and have the music swell so that the fans in the audience can get them clapping for recognizing their DC Comics actors. Like Spider-Verse, Across the Spider-Verse didn't do that, but The Flash did it. Like, there's a lot of scenes that just kind of stop dead in their tracks to remind you that, oh, hey, these characters existed once. It's like, it's playing up to the fans, but in a way that's very fan-specific, that I feel like there are aspects that are going to alienate the audience here. Because, like, at least with, like, Across the Spider-Verse, they did their due diligence to kind of like put like the little like expositional box at the bottom of the screen. So if you're confused, you can read it, and if you're watching it at home, you can pause it and look at it. And The Flash, even though that it slows down so that you can clap at all these cameos, you really have to be tuned into everything here. And even then, you have to just be amused by the mere sight of cameos here. And it gets to a point where it's just like, there's so many cameos and references here that by the time they offer like other big surprises, like, hey, look who we got to appear in this film, it's just kind of like, okay, yeah, but you've been doing that the whole film. It's like at some point the whole surprise value just, it wears off, and that by the time you get to the big climax in which they reveal another surprise actor for this. And we're just like, okay, yeah, all right, that tracks. I remember that character. So I'm very conflicted about this film because, like, on one level, it does have aspects of a Flash film that I would like to see. Like, I love like the amusing moments, the scenes where like the future Barry and past Barry are talking to each other and they have to understand their powers and how they work. There's some okay fight scenes. Like, I did like Supergirl's beatdown of Zod and all that, and the big prison escape is pretty cool. But there are so many elements that, like, this is a film that's like, it takes off well and then it stumbles, it falls, and then it gets back up, it tries again, you're rooting for it, and then it stumbles again. It gets up, keeps going, stumbles, and it gets so frustrating because I want this film to succeed because I do like Flashpoint and I would like to see a Flashpoint adaptation, but and especially like this type of adaptation of Flashpoint because it better personalizes the story and it closes it down enough so it doesn't get lost in like the muck of saying here's this character, here's this character, here's this character. But then it still does that because like then it still showcases all the cameos. We don't get as much time as I'd like with the characters. There are some fun moments and some charisma, but I don't feel we get enough time with like Supergirl and Batman where we care all that much for them. Beyond just like, you know, the fact that we don't want to see them die during the big climax, which is just like, it's a general emotion because like Keaton kind of feels like he's going through the motions, and Sasha Cole is in such a thankless role. I really do hope that she gets like some like Supergirl movie out of this, or that she, because I think like on James Gunn's slate there is a Supergirl movie. I hope she gets tapped for that. I really do because she deserves better. Because like yeah, like Ezra Miller is fine here. There's a lot of other like kind of like thankless roles, like Ron Livingston is Barry Allen's dad. He does okay for the few scenes he's given. You have Iris West, played by Kiersey Clemens, who kind of bookends the film. Not really given much of anything to do here. Kind of feels like wasted potential here. And I guess that's kind of the best way to describe the film, is that it feels like it has all this potential. It could be something bigger and grander that it's aiming to be. And yet there's this hinderation of like I have no idea whether or not like the big desert climax was shot that way just because like it was more convenient for the filmmaking, it was better for visual effects, or if it was an order from Warner Brothers, but it just comes off as a reflection of the limitations of the DCEU and how much and how far they can go with this material. Because like this is supposed to be a film where they integrate the Justice League, and you don't really see that much of the Justice League. So like between that and the limitations that are set up here, and especially when considering the source material that they're adapting here, it all just comes off like this should be the final chapter on the DCEU, and we can move on to better films after this one. And you know, as being like an exit film from that cinematic universe, it's not bad. It's not like, there are moments I genuinely enjoy, but then a lot of like stumbling moments that just like you feel like, God, this could do so much better if it wasn't like bound by like the same logic of the DCEU and just keep shoving cameos onto the screen every few minutes. There's a good film there, and it's just, it doesn't bubble to the surface, mostly because you can feel like the limitations at play here. So like, you know, I'm hopeful that, you know, we can get through this film and then, you know, get through the Aquaman film, which I don't want to spoil anything here, but like the post-credit scene also feels like they just want to shed the DCEU and knowing like the rest of their slate they got to get through. It just comes off that way. I'm not saying that the directors and writers just kind of like, okay, this is like the film where we're gonna like use to set up the reboot. I don't think it was like the case there, but the way that it's framed between this point in time and when we eventually get to James Gunn's restructuring of the DCEU, it's just how it reads here. Like, because we still got like we still got like was like the Blue Beetle film and the Aquaman sequel that are gonna come out eventually, and I don't know. I don't know. It kind of feels like the DCEU should have just ended here, just cut it off here. That being said, when I said that, it reflects like Flashpoint and how Flashpoint was gonna play into the New 52 and how that was a big reboot. The New 52 didn't reboot everything. Like, they still kept the storylines from like Frankenstein and Green Lantern. So it still took the elements that were working that they wanted to highlight here. And that's very much what James Gunn is going to do. James Gunn is going to continue on with like Amanda Waller and Peacemaker and stuff like that, but he's going to shed the stuff that doesn't work, which is honestly like it feels fairly faithful to the comics like that. So I'm in terms of like the Flash film itself, and it's weird because like it feels like I'm looking at this film more externally, mostly just because the film itself is just like, it's decent, but it's like, it's nothing that I'm going to watch again. And like it has a lot of positives going for it. Like, it's definitely one of the more comprehensible and firmly grounded DCEU films, especially when compared to stuff like, like the mess of Justice League and Batman v Superman and Wonder Woman 1984 and Black Adam. It's better, but it still has some messy elements, and it doesn't quite become like basically it doesn't become the Flashpoint film that I more or less wanted to see, especially since we already got an animated version of the Flashpoint comics that was very faithful and was pretty perfect. So if you want to see what you're missing with the Flash movie, I would definitely say check out the Flashpoint Paradox, the Justice League animated film from, like 10 years ago, I think that came out. So yeah, I would say check that out for a better film, because the way that this film plays, it just kind of feels like a lukewarm, average blockbuster meant to kind of just, herald in the next iteration of like a DC cinematic universe that will hopefully be better connected and hopefully be much better than what was set up by the Zack Snyderverse, or whatever you want to call it. So it's a fairly mid Flash film that I wish I could love more. I wish I could, because it does have good elements, but it just doesn't quite live up to the potential that I was kind of expecting from this material.